Welcome to the Rangers Roost. This is our weekly chat between myself, who is the creator and writer of Jump Rangers, and yourselves, who are the internet. Welcome to my office. It's uh, it's been an interesting week, and in the absence of anybody to speak with, I think I'm just going to talk a little bit about what makes this week so creatively interesting. I had a couple of last month was kind of a network building month for me. I think I revamped my whole social media approach, and out of that new approach, um, I met some new people and wound up doing some favors for folks. Um, I got paid to write an article, which was very nice. I hosted a and that article's on the angrynoodle.com if anybody wants to take a read. It's about the difference between it's about why the book is always better than the movie, so to speak, and what the systemic problems and what the structural problems are that writers have to overcome to actually resolve that, because writing for books is actually very different than writing for movies. I had a I had a kind of good morning Ipiluni. Ipiluni, for anyone who doesn't know, is the love of my life and also one of the voice actors who's going to be helping bring Jump Rangers to life as we make the transition into animation. I also had a seminar on talentville.com, which is a screenwriters kind of co-op website, um, owned and operated by one of the founders of Final Draft. That was a lot of fun, and I met some good people there. And listening to that conversation, Ipiluni convinced me to finally sit down and write a book about screenwriting, sharing my observations and sharing sharing kind of what makes a screenplay work for the actors and what makes a screenplay lead to a good movie, and what it takes to get actors and directors excited when they're reading a screenplay, and how to achieve that, and how to succeed basically as a writer, somebody who's probably pretty reclusive and unused to extremely collaborative environments, and certainly unused to cinematic and dramatic structure, coming into Hollywood and building a career. That's that's kind of what the book's about. It's going to be called And Action. I've already started writing. And on that subject, I guess the thing to talk about today is why the book is always better than the movie. This is something that I've discussed in many other venues. It's material I have no reason not to go over here on the Rangers Roost. It's something that's certainly of interest to anybody who's invested in pop culture. So that's what we're going to talk about. Um, and if anybody wants to step in and direct the conversation in another direction, please feel free. If anybody's watching and they're just catching up and they want to have their say and take things in some other direction, that's what I'm here for. I'm here to answer questions and talk to the people. So, why is the book always better than the movie? Writing good literature and writing good journalism and actually writing good stand-up comedy, as it happens, is all about making observations. Okay? We're observing our characters to see in more and more detail as those observations compound what they're like and who they are, and kind of dig down to the core of them, right? And we turn those observations into a story by uniting them with theme. So if we're making observations about, you know, a person's relationship, a character's relationship with love, or a character's relationship with trauma, or anything, we'll say, okay, well, here's what they're like under these circumstances, and then let's observe what they're like under these circumstances. Let's explore on the basis of this theme deeper and deeper levels of who this person is until we get to the core. And as writers, the way to create tension on the page and to keep the reader flipping pages is to juxtapose themes. So if you have love Hang on one sec. I'm getting a text from Ippy Looney. So we're going to pause this for a second. Hang on. What am I watching? I think that might be a text from last night or something. I'm not watching anything. Maybe they mean, where is my eye line directed? Do I have to fix my eye line? Anyway, I'm not getting any feedback. That's okay. So, I don't know what I was talking about. I don't know. It had something to do with the stories, right? We were talking about stories. So, um, the we're talking about observations in literature. So you keep a reader reading by juxtaposing themes. If you're writing a story about love, but there's also a lot of loss, if those two themes are on the page together, then the reader knows there's an imbalance there. They have a sense that nothing good can come of the relationship between those two themes, right? They don't know what you're going to do with that imbalance. So they keep reading and they keep turning pages to find out what you're going to do about it. And that's where it goes. That's how it works. Um, hang on one sec. We are in the process of organizing a new. Oh, so we're starting a new Jump Rangers game, and I'm just lining up the schedules. And both of our players are extremely busy people, so when they get back to me on Discord, I did want to make sure that I just took a second to sort that out. So you create juxtaposition on the page to create tension, and that kind of keeps the reader reading. All of this is based on the observations that we're making about our characters. The problem that we have when we write for cinema is that um, in a movie or in a TV show or even in a play, anytime we're writing for actors, the audience actually doesn't want our observations. I know this kind of sounds semantic, and have any books been well adapted? We'll talk about that in a second. Yes, of course. Um, but the problem that we have is that audiences don't want our observations in the first place. Audiences come to watch. They want to make their own observations. So we need to use a system of communication. We have to build a structure around something that the audience is actually going to watch, as opposed to just having them see what we're saying, as opposed to just sharing what we see. We need to let them watch for themselves. And that is why cinema is a language of action. Okay? What that means in the most basic sense is that stories on the screen are not about what happens to our characters and how they react. Stories on the screen are about the things that our characters are actively doing to accomplish goals. So the more we set things up, the more we build a plot around our characters to kind of push them forward, the less the audience is watching and the more they're just kind of waiting to see what happens. And that's not good. That's not what we want. Um, and that's fundamentally different from literature, because in literature, we're constantly having things happen to our characters, right? We put our characters in situations so that we can see how they react, so that we can study them as closely as possible. And that's where the story comes from. That's that's actually the mechanic by which literature is. It's also stand-up comedy. It's all about observation. Here's what I saw walking to work today. You won't believe it. That's stand-up, right? Journalism is the same. Here's what's happening in the world. Here are some raw observations for you to digest and interpret as you need to. That's it. Most of writing is about observational craft, and that has almost no place in screenwriting, and this is where writers get lost. So instead of writing stories that drive the characters, we need to write characters that drive the story. Instead of having things happen to the characters, we need to have the characters doing things that move that they need to create their own plot. They can't be in the passenger seat. They need to be in the driver's seat. So have any good books been adapted? Yeah, well, sure. Um, and all of this exists on some kind of spectrum. We want to aspire to a perfectly active story, but there are plenty of stories that have a little bit of reaction and manage to get away with it because they kind of pull out of the nosedive, right? A good example of that is The Martian. Um, the Martian is, for anyone who doesn't know, a Matt Damon movie directed by Ridley Scott about a guy who got left behind on Mars and is trying to survive and create opportunities for him to be rescued. Now, in the beginning of the movie, he does get left behind on Mars. That's something that happens to him. It's it's all in the context of him trying to accomplish his mission. He's trying to make sure that the mission's a success at every stage. So they kind of slipped that in there, in the middle of a bunch of action. It's still a little bit fishy, but as soon as his the rest of his crew leaves Mars and leaves him behind and starts looking for a way to help him survive, um, he's not just waiting to be rescued and he's not just trying to stay alive. He's actually trying to create opportunities to get the help he needs. He's trying to bring NASA to him just as much as NASA's trying to get to him. And that active approach to the story really helps. Really helps drive the narrative, and it winds up being a very good literary adaptation. Um, One of the best screenplays, I'm pretty sure, is an adaptation of an expose that was written called Spotlight. It's about the group of reporters at the Boston Globe who exposed the Catholic Church's um, sexual abuse scandals, and and I'm pretty sure that's based on a book written by journalists about how it was done. I'm almost positive. And that book is all action. That book is just about reporters trying to break a story. There really isn't even a point when the story kind of lands in their lap. The story begins with everybody coming together and pitching stories that they want to run for the next major publication. Spotlight isn't a weekly publication in the Boston Globe. It would come up every so often. It was an investigative division of the Boston Globe, and so they just finished a big report and they were pitching stories to their lead editor on about to run next, and one of the reporters had that story and thought it was important enough to look into, and so everybody was doing their job. Everybody was doing what they were trying to accomplish. The editor is trying to come up with a good story. So he's like, okay, we'll do a little digging and see if there's something really there, and if there is, we'll look at that. So they run off when they do their digging and they find some alarming things, and they come back and they say, well, here's these alarming facts that I found. The editor says, okay, this merits our attention. So now let's put more reporters on it. Let's have people start working on this. And they start assigning different aspects of the problem to the different reporters. And so a three-act structure isn't just about the things that happen to a character and how they inform that character's quote-unquote catharsis. That's more of a literary concept again, okay? A three-act structure is about how the efforts of the character evolve over time. The beginning of the second act in that movie, in any movie, is when the protagonist starts putting themselves in danger. They start exposing themselves to risk in order to accomplish their goals, right? So, in this particular case, we have a story that's going to bring a lot of problems to the Boston Globe. There's a whole network of support, a whole community of support for the Catholic Church in Boston. Nobody wants there to be a scandal. Even people who are involved negatively, who are victims of this scandal, are inclined to protect the church. So there's going to be a lot of political issues. And as soon as these reporters start kind of waking up those sleeping giants and causing problems for the paper, you're in the second act because everybody's at risk of losing their job at that point. They've, through their efforts to write the story, they have created a. Now, of course, yes, the Catholic Church created the problem, but the story is not about the problem. The story is about writing the article. It's about actually conducting the investigation and doing the work of breaking the story. And in their work of breaking this story, these reporters have created the possibility of getting fired from their jobs. And ultimately, they're going to create um, their own biggest problem, which is that they've created a story that no one wants to give them supporting evidence for, and as a result, they have no story. They've put in all this work, they've caused all these problems, and they do not have the smoking gun that they need to sell it to the public, which means they've done all this work for nothing, and there's going to be huge consequences for that to them. That's the end of the second act, and of course it is. And then they find a smoking gun. They double down. They find some other place to look. They think about the story in a different way, and now you're in the third act. It's a fantastic screenplay. There's been plenty of others. We just Evan Ipiluni just saw Lord of the Rings for the first time, which is a delightful adaptation. And so much of the book is about the world building and the context and the songs and the relationships between the characters. But the movie really is about the work of getting the ring to Mount Doom by any means necessary, even if it means starting a war to distract Sauron from what's happening, even if it means picking apart his empire of power and putting up a credible threat. Now, there's lots of conveniences in Lord of the Rings, obviously. It's very handy that an army of Ents just shows up when there's no hope of beating these orcs. That's very handy, or that Elrond sends a whole bunch of elves to just wreak havoc when, his mission is to get everybody out. His mission is to get the elves back to the Western Shores. So, you know, it's not a perfect adaptation, but it is a lot more active than the books are, and at the same time, very, very, what you call it, faithful. So, yes, yes, there are good literary adaptations. It is what happens in the book, but you have to, and this is the tricky thing, you have to kind of read between the lines. When you're adapting a book, you don't want to tell the same story that's in the book. You just want it to fit in the same space. You don't want it to contradict the story that's in the book. But you're not telling the same story. The book is about what happened to these characters. The movie is about what the characters did. So, when you look at my favorite example to use, and it's one that I use in the article I just wrote, is Long Walk to Freedom by Nelson Mandela. Obviously, a compelling character. Obviously, somebody with a lot to offer. Clearly, okay? I know it's not the 80s anymore, and there's probably kids out there who don't know who Nelson Mandela is. He was the president of South Africa for quite some time. He became president of South Africa because in the 1940s, um, South Africa was under a system called apartheid, which was extremely militant, violent form of segregation, where black people were living in shanty towns, and they needed licenses to get to the white sectors of town. It was very, very um, dark, futuresque in terms of how things were managed. And um, Nelson Mandela got thrown in prison, and in prison, he decided to run a campaign to become president to fight the injustices that were befalling his people, and he actually won the election. And he created a situation where um, the white systems of power had to abdicate that power or face civil war. And rather than go through the process of annihilating as many people as we're going to be annihilated. That it was going to be a gruesome, bloody civil war, and they said, you know what, you won the election, you're president, and and things started to change. They're not perfect. It's South Africa's a mess, but things are a lot better than they were. And so it's a compelling story because it's such a huge arc. But the mistake that everybody makes, and the story that Nelson tells in his autobiography, which again, it's about observations. He's not wrong for telling the story. His book is called Long Walk to Freedom, and it's about his thoughts and mental exercises and practices in prison to help him create what he created in the ANC, the African National Council committee. So anyway, that was the party that he created. And when you look at that story through that lens and you make a movie about it, you're making a movie about a character who's victimized by a system of oppression. It really is, in that case, the judicial system of South Africa that created Nelson Mandela. That's the message that the movie's sending. And you watch that movie, and it feels like you're being asked to feel sorry for this character. But getting thrown in prison is not an action. And Nelson Mandela probably wasn't reacting when he ran for president. You don't just. No, no. But people are very humble when they write them, or very reverent. If it's an autobiography, people tend to be very humble. Oh, this wasn't me. I didn't do this. I was just in the right place at the right time, and here's what happened. And that's not a good movie. And it's also not. I mean, it may be true from a certain perspective, and we're going to get into that in this example. But it's not universally true. And then when people write biographies about other people, they're like, oh, this person is this, and this person is that. And then you wind up with a movie like 42, the Jackie Robinson story, which is just a bunch of scenes showing Jackie Robinson being wise and teaching people the magic of inclusion, which is not. I mean, that man went out to win baseball games despite the fact that the whole crowd wanted to kill him. That man changed people's idea of what was possible by insisting on winning baseball games when he wasn't allowed to. That's a much scarier movie in real life than it was on the screen. There's a lot more at stake, but Jackie Robinson also had a very clear line of action, which is to win baseball. Like the actual, all of it. Even though, and so it wasn't even necessarily for him about race. It was a tool that liberated people, but he was there to realize his potential in the face of overwhelming odds, and instead they made it a story about uplifting the community and this and that, which just isn't how sports works. I understand that it may have been a theme in the story. It certainly was. It certainly was. But you don't want to make that theme the arc. You want to focus on the efforts of the character to accomplish their goal. So in the case of Nelson Mandela, we ask ourselves, did he just become this political mastermind when he was thrown in prison? Did he become an activist and learn politics in prison? Turns out he did not. Nelson Mandela went to law school and was working as an attorney when they locked him up. Why did they lock him up? Well, because he was winning cases for black families. Nelson Mandela went to law school under apartheid in the 1940s in Johannesburg. Do we really think that this man had no plan for the future? Did he go to law school because he thought it was going to be a good job and a good job for a black man to have in the 1940s? No. You don't want to stick your head out in a system like that. It's going to get chopped off. No. He went to law school to help people in his community, and he knew that helping people in his community wasn't what the system wanted him to do. He knew that. Did he get? I don't think he expected to get thrown in jail for it. I don't think so. I think he probably figured he was going to encounter some resistance. I think he figured, well, maybe we can make the system a little more fair. Maybe we can make people listen. Turns out, no, you can't, Nelson. And then, so they threw him in jail. This is when he starts really encountering real, resistance, real consequences. He's encountering real conflict. So now we're in Act 2. And he just doesn't give up. He says, okay, well, so if they're going to throw me in jail for winning court cases, I can't change the system by winning court cases. I have to lead the system to a better place. And then, I mean, even if you read the autobiography, at that point he has to coach guards, teach guards how to understand his humanity. And eventually he starts finding people who are willing to take messages for him out of the prison to his wife or to people like Desmond Tutu. And, you know, that coaching process ended up creating a system of communication by which he was able to stay at current events. He was able to get newspapers. He was able to get all the information he needed to help run his campaign. And the guards that beat him, as it turns out, were the guards carrying the messages. The guards that beat him, part of their job and part of what Nelson needed them to do was to rough him up bad enough that nobody else felt the need to do it, so that he could get his messages to them and not risk being discovered by someone else. He built that system. It wasn't like a friendly guard walked by his cell one day. Some white guard said, "Oh, geez, Nelson, look, I don't necessarily believe in all this equality stuff, but what they're doing to you is just terrible. Is there anything I can do?" That's not what happened. That's not how that works. Right? People are pursuing their own goals. Every guard who works at that prison has a job. They have a job because they're trying to accomplish something in their life and they need the money that comes from that job. So, what Nelson had to teach people was that the things that you're trying to accomplish, you're trying to build a good life for your kids. Well, look at this country for a second and ask yourself, what life do you want your kids to have? What future do you see here? What are you looking at when you see this country? Is If this goes further, because nothing stays where it is, things are going to get better or worse. If this keeps happening and growing, is that a world that your kids deserve? Or do they deserve better? I'm going to help you accomplish your goal, but you need to help me accomplish mine. He did that. And that's what people don't understand about autobiographies. Jackie Robinson did win baseball. And he did it by becoming an amazing baseball player. And he did it at incredible personal risk. He did it so successfully that it not only changed professional sports, it changed race relations. And the movie wasn't about him working on his game and working on the support system around his game to the point where he was able to accomplish those goals. It didn't have that level of urgency. Imagine Jackie Robinson walking out into a ball field, out of the locker room, and just hearing the rage and screaming, and just even that long walk from the locker room to the ball field to me sounds very intimidating. If he's going out there to win baseball games, he's got to keep that out of his head. And those people are going to be violent. They're going to throw things. They're going to threaten his life on a daily basis, all the time, minute to minute. And he's just got to go out there and take that pitcher down, just strip that pitcher down, and he's going to do it. And you could do that slow. You can do it fast. There's all kinds of ways that you can shoot that. Well, so if you want to adapt a book, the thing to do is to take a step back from the story and ask yourself, what is the character actually achieving? What are they actually doing? Where do they end up? How is it their responsibility? And what parts of this story are about them doing the things they need to do to accomplish that goal? There's basically two ways to approach an adaptation. If you're willing to shrink the scope of the story, if the story has passive elements, but the character does something important and big over the course of that story, you can just tell the story of how they do that one thing. You can take that smaller story of the thing that they did. You know what I mean? If if there's a book about the life and times of Bonnie and Clyde, right? And you want to adapt the story, you can just tell the story about the crime spree and how they tried to get rich or die trying. You don't need to get into their childhood and show where they came from and blah, blah, blah. Just tell the story of what they did and how they did it. Alternatively, if you're going to adapt the whole story, then you need to look at the narrative arc and where they wind up and what happens to them. And you have to ask yourself, and this is the tricky part, this is the part that drives writers away from this format. You have to ask yourself, what if it was all their fault? What if they were trying to accomplish something and all of these things happened because of their efforts to accomplish this thing? What would that have been? Maybe they didn't achieve it. Maybe they never got there, or maybe they did in a way they didn't expect. But what if this whole story, this whole series of events, was the consequence of their efforts to accomplish X? That's an algebra equation, right? What is X? That's the puzzle you have to solve. What could they have been trying to accomplish if everything that happened to them turned out to be something they did to themselves? Okay? Now, the first thing you have to do is try to disprove X. You have to go and say, okay, so if I'm saying that this whole story is their own fault and the consequence of things they did to themselves in order to accomplish this thing, is there anything in this story that tells me they were not, in fact, trying to accomplish this thing? Is there anything they did that stands in the way of that interpretation of this story? No? Are you sure? And if there's not, then you tell the story about how they're trying to accomplish that thing, which is going to use all the same. They're going to create all the situations that were created in the novel. They're going to create all the problems for themselves, but it's going to be fights that they pick, and it might be subtle. They might be picking these fights in their relationships. It's not necessarily that they're going to um, create all the hostility against them, but they're going to force the hands of people around them in the pursuit of those people's goals. And those people are going to do the things to the protagonist that they do because the protagonist's efforts to accomplish their goal are in that person's way. If I'm, you know, if I'm a judge and Nelson Mandela is trying to win a case against me, I'm going to hold him in contempt of court. I'm going to throw him in prison. You know what I mean? I'm going to use whatever laws are available to me to accomplish my goal. And those but it's Nelson Mandela's efforts to win this case that are putting me in this position. I hadn't planned on throwing him in jail. It's just something I need to do to accomplish my goal. Because otherwise this guy's going to keep winning cases and that's going to be my fault. Right? So Nelson Mandela is creating the narrative and I'm the protagonist of my own story trying to accomplish my own goals and I have to deal with his crap. And that is how you handle all of the events of the story. It's things that the character, the protagonist, is forcing into existence through their efforts to accomplish their goal. So what would that goal have been? And that's challenging and hard. But the more time you spend with story, the more intuitive that process gets. Adapting novels isn't super hard for me these days. Oh, The Martian is one. Let's see. I've got a bunch on my shelf. I like The Fisher King by Terry Gilliam. I like. I'm just peeking over at my Blu-ray shelf right now. I like many of the Avengers movies. I like. Read question. So Ippy Looney's asking what my favorite adaptations are. People are gonna see the chat though on the stream. I think. Oh no, I guess they won't. I guess they won't. Um, I should probably put the chat on the stream. That would be helpful. And I'm sure I can export it. I'll do that. That's a smart thing for me to do. Um, I like The Departed. I like I like a number of Martin Scorsese's movies. I like there's a bunch. There's a bunch. Uh that's probably a good place to end the stream. It's been 40 minutes. So, thank you to anybody who's been watching. I hope this has been an illuminating discussion. And I'm going to be back on Thursday, 5 p.m. on this stream for Ranger Stories. We're almost at the end of editing the Rangers book. Any books you really wish the movie was good? I'm not gonna. I'm not gonna do that to somebody. You know what I mean? Um, one of my friends likes to say that he's not. He's Aaron is his name. He's an actor. He doesn't talk about a show within X number of yards, 1,000 yards of the show. If you want to hear what he has to say about a show, you need to get him out of the space, buy him a drink, make a date with him, buy him coffee, whatever. Right? Don't shit where you eat. Don't don't talk about don't talk about backstage issues front of house. Don't ruin the audience's good time. And this stream is front of house. So it's not a good idea to badmouth other people's work in public, I think. Unless there's a safety issue. Unless somebody's, you know, compromising other people's safety, which I think is always important to talk about. Well, because the book is popular and because um, people want to see that story performed by actors that they know, and because oftentimes people do have creative issues with previous works. Maybe they feel it wasn't faithful enough, or maybe they feel it wasn't cinematic enough. Basically, it's going to be one of those two things. So it's a push and pull thing. But that's not new. I mean, how many times has the story of Dr. Faustus been written? Lots. So that's it for this week. Thank you very much for watching. Come by at 5 p.m. on Thursday, Pacific time, if you want to see, if you want to read through the next chapter of Jump Rangers, a game called Conquest with me. And in the meantime, don't be a stranger, Ranger. I do stream Star Citizen and soon perhaps other games on twitch.tv/Tekker10, TEKKERTEN as well. That's usually around 10 o'clock. And I do it right now. I'm doing it Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays. So come on by and say hi. Don't be a stranger, Ranger.